Hi, everyone, and thank you, Adrian, for inviting me to give this short, hopefully entertaining talk. I'm going to talk about sort of printing in the 16th century, the Reformation. Hopefully it'll be fun. My background, so a little bit about me. I have a PhD in early modern European history, but I focus primarily on the 17th century. And I'll talk a little bit about the 17th century at the end. But as I mentioned, material is primarily going to be produced in the 1500s. So what I'm going to talk about is the really interesting collections of leaves from early printed Bibles, as well as several complete Bibles that the Printing Museum has. And what I want to do is talk about these materials in the context of the time in which they were created. So here's the printing display from the old, the Protestant Reformation and printing in the vernacular from the now old Printing Museum space. I'm not sure what it's going to look like in the new one, but that is the way it was displayed previously. And I think that looking at these materials in this case, we can sometimes lose sight of the fact that these materials were, in a lot of ways, living objects. They were bought, sold, smuggled, read, burned, and were often far more dangerous to their owners and readers than we might suppose today. So I'm going to discuss sort of the context around their creation a little bit, and then get into a little bit more detail about the individual materials themselves. So first, some context. Printing and religion sort of went hand in hand in early modern Europe. The first products appearing from the press following the development of printing in Western Europe were primarily religious. And this is because these materials were sort of sure bets. They were conservative materials with a known audience. It didn't hurt that the church was willing to pay and or commission some of this material. So printers were assured of a payday at the end of all of it. And especially within the first 50 to 75 years, much of the printed materials that appeared were sponsored in part by the Catholic Church or were religious in nature. And they remained central after that as well in the sort of changed context of the Protestant Reformation. And I think it's important to remember here that religion, much more so than today for a lot of people, was at the center of virtually everyone in Western Europe's lives in the early modern period. This contributed to much of the turmoil, but also led to a lot of these printed productions. So much of the religious material that appeared was short and cheap, but of course there were major projects as well that were often produced at major cost to producers. So think the 42-line Bible produced by Gutenberg, displayed here at the center of this slide, that contributed a lot to his financial problems in the 15th century. There were also religious productions during this period were shaped by a variety of other cultural developments. Specifically, I'm thinking the rise of humanism and humanistic thought, which focused on sort of a return to and a seeking out of Greek and Latin original texts from the ancient world, shorn of medieval commentary, and more generally, humanists sought to provide readers access to these original texts. So one example of this from the Printing Museum collection is their leaf from the Complutensian Polyglot Bible, which included the biblical texts in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic in different parts of the Bible. This was produced by Spanish scholars and clerics in and around Madrid, and it was part of a longer scholarly tradition within Spain itself that involved a lot of translation. There were a lot of mixing of different languages and cultures in the Spanish world, but it also provides an example of sort of a humanist style version of philology. And so you can see it up here on the right-hand side of the slide there. And it's a pretty amazing piece of printing. So there are lots of other examples of this type of religious printing. And humanists not only collated and edited religious texts, original religious texts from the ancient world, but in their readings of these developed criticisms of the contemporary church. This questioning set the stage in some respects for what we now call sort of the Protestant Reform movement. But even with this criticism, in the mid-1510s, the church really didn't show any signs of rupture. What became the Protestant Reform movement can sort of be seen as a contingent series of events following the posting of a list of 95 theses for academic debate by an obscure professor and Augustinian friar named Martin Luther, a name most people are familiar with, who initially sought to debate church practices internally and aimed for internal reform. He initially circulated the theses in Latin, sent them to the Archbishop of Mainz and a select group of clerics for debate. But their responses to this and sort of the growing animosity between Luther and certain conservative theologians in the church led to this debate spiraling out of control in a variety of different ways. And Luther ultimately began to articulate a series of theological views that were distinct from Orthodox teachings. I'm not going to get into the weeds of that here. I guess we could just summarize it by saying he comes to the idea, looking back at ancient authorities, of justification by faith alone, and sort of rejecting the idea that works play a role in achieving salvation. And while Luther's own views are, well and good, the actual Protestant Reform movement that grew from these initial debates would not have been possible without the fact that through preaching, imagery, and writing and printing, especially, Luther gained support of local lay people. This was something that other reformers as well, such as Ulrich Zwingli and later John Calvin, would also do. And this helped spread Protestant beliefs and also provided a safe space for these reformers in local towns, and gave them sort of a buffer from outside forces that were unhappy with what they were doing. And a major part of their, of what we might think of as a propaganda effort by these reformers was this turn to vernacular print and debates to advance views. So printing was sort of helped spur and was also supported by the Protestant reformers. The Protestant printing centers in Western Europe became immensely profitable. In Luther's home of Wittenberg, in Geneva, where John Calvin was later based, and in places like the Low Countries, where a large number of reformers congregated, printers made a killing. And this was no small reason why all of these Protestant imprints appeared. There was a demand for them, and printers recognized that they could make a lot of money doing this. Some of them obviously also ascribed to the new faith. So the printing medium collections are based primarily around English works. So I'm going to spend the bulk of the rest of the time on developments there. Reform in England took a very specific trajectory related to the political and religious needs and interests of its rulers. So Henry VIII broke from Rome more as a political expediency in his efforts to have his marriage with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, annulled because they had not had a male heir. And in the process, he established a Church of England separate from the Roman Church that was controlled from the top by the monarchy. Reform-minded individuals, those with sort of evangelical or Protestant leanings, played a role in shaping this church. But there were also largely conservative elements as well, including Henry himself, who we should remember published against Luther after his break with Rome, and was actually awarded the title the Defender of the Faith by the Pope because of it. So ultimately, decisions about the theological and ecclesiastical structure were made by Henry and those close to him, but they were not necessarily made out of firm doctrinal convictions. Reformers like Thomas Cranmer, who sort of moved more and more towards Protestantism over the course of the 1520s and 1530s, and Thomas Cromwell also played a role, but many remained supportive of the Roman Church. So you could think of it as churches reform directed from the top, while there was growing pressure from evangelicals, often from outside the halls of power. And there's lots of historiographical writing on this subject, and it's it takes up books and books and books. And I'm happy to share sources if folks are interested. But what I want to talk about more is sort of the actual evangelicals, English evangelicals, and sort of continental printing, which is where sort of some of the printing museum's collections arise from. So from the 1520s, many English evangelicals moved back and forth between their home country and continental Europe, with places like Antwerp becoming major early printing centers for English language Protestant printing. Figures like William Tyndale, Miles Coverdale, and John Rogers were exposed to Protestant ideas on the continent, and later would spend time in exile there due to changing political circumstances in England. Some of the first English Bibles were produced in print in continental Europe, in Antwerp and elsewhere, and they were actually smuggled into England. And I think it's useful to point out that these were often dangerous books, especially Tyndale's early translations of the New Testament in the 1520s. With Protestantism not yet acceptable in England, finding yourself with one of these and being caught by the authorities, or even a business associate that didn't like what they saw, could be quite dangerous. Ultimately, these works, though, that are in the Printing Museum collection, what I have on the screen here, the Coverdale Bible, a leaf from the Tyndale Bible, and a leaf from the Matthew Bible, all sort of originating from Tyndale, John Rogers, and Miles Coverdale's translations of Greek and Latin versions of the Bible. They would become the basis for an authorized English Bible in 1539, known as the Great Bible. But again, I want to emphasize that in this ongoing process of religious reform, there are great opportunities for translators to make their mark, but there are also great dangers for figures across confessional lines. Books were banned and burned in both Catholic and Protestant states. Perhaps most well-known is the index of prohibited books created by the Catholic Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition. But in England, this happened as well. In 1536, for example, Northern English rebels burned the works of Tyndale and other religious reformers as part of their protests against state religious changes. And more pertinently, numerous individuals were executed due to their religious and political convictions. Luther was famously saved from execution early in his career after the Diet of Worms. And then he was whisked off covertly to a castle, and he translated the New Testament into German, and it became this grand legend of the Lutheran reform movement. English reformers also were executed. William Tyndale and John Rogers were both executed. Tyndale actually in sort of the Low Countries in the 1530s. And John Rogers was executed during the reign of Mary I. But conservative voices were also executed. So someone like Thomas More, who was a statesman, one of the leaders of leaders of the English state in the 1520s, is turned on by Henry VIII and executed. And in England in particular, changing state religious policies shaped this climate. Under Henry VIII, as I mentioned, support for Protestant policies fluctuated throughout his later reign. During his son Edward VI's short reign, reformers did achieve great gains, but those were quickly rolled back when Edward's sisters Mary came to the throne, and England was restored to the Roman Catholic fold. Numerous Protestants were persecuted. For Protestants, and this brings me to the slide, this persecution was memorialized in the later work of John Foxe, whose Acts and Monuments are also known as his Book of Martyrs. One of the most popular texts in the English language ever produced, crafted a history of the English Protestant Church that was ascendant under Elizabeth I after suffering for so many years. And the image I have on this slide is from an edition of Fox of Tyndale's execution. And there are lots of similar dramatic woodcuts of martyrs at their moment of death. And this one's great because you can see it says, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Those were Tyndale's famous last words, hoping that Henry VIII would see the light and turn towards Protestantism. So under Mary, as I mentioned, many Protestants were persecuted, but many fled abroad. And some of them traveled to Geneva, which was the center of Reformed or Protestantism or Calvinism, and led obviously by John Calvin. And here they produced another version, another Protestant version of an English Bible, which is now known as the Geneva Bible, and it first appeared in 1560. The version on screen here, the top left, is from the Printing Museum's collection. It's a leaf from a 1598 edition of this. One of the interesting things about this work is it included extensive commentaries on the text, often with a very Calvinist tone, advocating for their belief system in the commentaries. And when Mary died in 1558 and Elizabeth I became the Queen of England, this Bible became was able to circulate freely in England and became one of the most widely read during the latter half of the century. Elizabeth's church did produce its own authorized version known as the Bishop's Bible in 1568, I think. But that was produced primarily for the churches themselves. So they were these very large folio volumes that would not have circulated with lay people. So the Geneva Bible sort of became the de facto Bible that folks were reading. And it reflects some of the trends in English Protestantism that would continue to crop up in later centuries, later in that century. A push for an increasingly stringent view of faith in the Calvinist tradition did not necessarily accord with state policies, which would become a problem. And many of its translators would later lean more and more towards views increasingly associated with what became known as Puritanism, or as scholars of the period would refer to as the hotter sort of Protestants, which is an especially conservative version of the faith that had a major impact in shaping politics and religion through Elizabeth's reign, and especially under James I and Charles I's reigns. The Geneva Bible also had an impact on subsequent translations. I've already mentioned the Bishop's Bible, but it also had an important impact in a variety of ways on the King James Version of the Bible, which was printed in 1611. This was an official authoritative version produced under James I, who took the throne after Elizabeth. It built on a number of earlier translations, including the Geneva Bible. And it was established sort of as a final authoritative version of the Bible for the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church. Its creation was a massive undertaking, and there's a lot of really interesting work actually happening right now on the production of the King James Version of the Bible. There are a huge number of translators working at the universities of Cambridge and Oxford, as well as in London and Westminster to create it. And recently, scholars have uncovered early sort of translation notes by some of the scholars that were working on the Bible in the 17th century, which is really cool. And they're working on putting together some essays and books describing how this process worked. And I mean, importantly, maybe the most important thing about the King James Version is it remains one of the most common translations of the Bible even today. And I think we can sort of see it as a significant point in the long process of acceptance and contestation over an English translation of the Bible. And you can see it here on the screen in the bottom left. Compared to the Geneva Bible above it, there are significantly fewer annotations along the marginal annotations along the side of the work. And it's written in a much more florid prose. So there are lots of other things we could talk about, but I want to sort of close with something that I've sort of ignored since the start of the talk, which is Catholicism in England in the Reformation period. And this is because there are several sort of what might seem like curiosities, including in the Printing Museum's display case. The Douai Rheims Bible and the Rheims New Testament. These were Catholic English translations of the Bible from the later 16th and early 17th century. They were produced at the English College of Douai in northern France, which was a training center for English Catholic clergy set up following the Reformation. And by most accounts, these are not particularly elegant translations. They're drawn from the Latin Vulgate, which was the Latin version of the Bible originally created by Saint Jerome in much earlier. And it sort of they lack the panache of the King James Version. If you were to read passages side by side, you would be struck by just how turgid the prose was in the Douai Rheims Bibles. But what they highlight, I think, is that while Protestantism might have seemed ascendant in England in this period, Catholicism never really died out. Many remain nostalgic for the faith, and many continue to practice the faith. English Catholics lived discreetly in England. They traveled abroad. Many lived in exile much of their lives. There were numerous attempts by Catholic missions to attempt to restore Catholicism throughout the 1500s and 1600s. They participated in conspiracies such as the Gunpowder Plot to upset the English political order, restore Catholicism as a state religion. And for the priests and lay people involved in these, this was a fraught, very dangerous experience. But they continued to subscribe to the faith, and they continued to smuggle Catholic versions of the Bible into England and other Catholic materials, which was an incredibly dangerous thing to do. The Douai Rheims Bible was specifically created as sort of a proselytizing piece to give to, literate English people who might not read Latin, to try to counter Protestant versions of the Bible. So I want to close with one particularly well-worn version of a Catholic Bible, annotated by an English Catholic reader by the name of Thomas Marwood in the early 18th century. It's not a Douai Rheims Bible, but actually a 1605 Antwerp edition of the Latin Vulgate. And I think this, not just for Catholic readers, but I think this shows how these, this was annotated 100 years after this book was produced. It shows how these materials continue to be read and pored over in the centuries after their creation, and how sort of these old books that we've discussed today had long and exciting afterlives before they arrived in the Printing Museum's display case. So there's lots more to cover, but I'll wrap up there. Thank you all for coming.
And we will hope to reinstall most of the items too when we move into our new space. We also have the chance to kind of reevaluate, reassess, and perhaps reinterpret what we have on display, bring out some items that haven't previously been out, and cycle through. So we're excited about that opportunity too, that goes along with moving an entire museum. Well, thank you all. Wish you a wonderful evening.
Thank you all for coming.
And we'll wrap it up there. Have a great night, and thanks again.